We are going to end today promptly at 4:45 for those of you who are wondering what our timing is, given the fact that we're operating on Joe Biden time now. My name is Glenn Hutchins. I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this panel. I'm going to introduce the people on the panel first, then we're going to hear from the two papers we have being presented, and then we're going to talk about each of the two papers, and we'll take some quick questions from people in the audience. Sitting to my left here is Jared Bernstein. He's the Senior Fellow of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which he's a job he took after serving as Chief Economist and Economic Advisor to the Vice President, Joe Biden. Are you responsible for his punctuality today? Is that the idea?
I'm always on Biden time.
Jared's areas of expertise include federal and state economic and fiscal policies, income inequality and mobility, trends in employment and earnings, international comparisons, and financial and housing markets. He is a prolific author, most notably of the forthcoming book, go out and buy it as soon as it comes out, The Reconnection Agenda, Reuniting Growth and Prosperity. To his left is Chanelle Hardy, Senior Vice President for Policy at the National Urban League and Executive Director of its Washington Bureau. Her policy work focuses on civil rights and urban economic policy with a focus, among other things, on job creation and entrepreneurship, perfect for today. Prior to her joining the League, she worked in Congress as a Chief of Staff and Counsel, and among her many other roles, one of my favorites, she was a 5th grade Teach for America teacher here in Washington, D.C. Bravo, good for you. To her left is Adriana Kugler, Professor at Georgetown, where she's the Vice Provost, for faculty. She previously served as the Chief Economist at the U.S. Department of Labor. Her research interests include labor markets and policy evaluation in both developed and developing countries. And her work evaluating the impact of labor policies and regulations was recognized in 2007 with the prestigious John T. Dunlop Outstanding Scholar Award. Finally, to her left, our author, I think, Michael, you're going to go first. Our first author, Michael Barr, Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, where he teaches domestic and international financial regulation. He's also a professor at the Ford School of Public Policy. He served in 2009 and 2010 as the U.S. Department of Treasury's Assistant Secretary for Financial Institutions, where he takes credit for being a key architect of Dodd-Frank, something you can say more openly in Washington than in New York, where I'm from, and the Consumer Protection Act. Maybe that's why he went out to Michigan to work. Protection Act of 2010. Among his other government roles, which he's had many, most notably he served, according to a person in the room here with us, as Bob Rubin's Special Assistant and Deputy Assistant Secretary. So Michael, why don't you launch into telling us about your paper?
Thanks very much, Glenn, for that, I believe, warm introduction. And to the Hamilton Project for inviting me here today. I think that the conversation we had this morning and over lunch and then with Vice President Biden and the panel just now are really important parts of a conversation that the country's engaged in, I think, on a serious level for the first time in quite a while about how to make the economy work better for everybody. And I think that's a welcome and needed change from the past. And my paper, I situate in that broader context of thinking about how to make the economy more inclusive, how to deal with inequality in the country, how to encourage the creation of more jobs, and how to make finance safer and fairer and work better for the real economy. And I think that's a challenging task, and the paper that I've done here is obviously only one very small part of that piece. I'm focused in particular on the needs of the entrepreneurial community, particularly expanding the inclusiveness of entrepreneurship for minorities and for women. We have a very strong and vital entrepreneurial culture in the United States. We have a very vibrant capital market that, in general, is terrific at expanding the ability of businesses to form and to grow and to create jobs and to promote innovation and, at bottom, to increase economic growth. But at the same time, we don't do a good enough job, in my view, in making sure that that growth is inclusive and making sure that minority entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs have the same opportunities to get ahead as others do. And I think given the need of our country to grow and to create more jobs and to increase our entrepreneurial activity, to increase the pace of business formation, we're going to need to develop strategies that do better at making sure the talents of everybody in our society are used to achieve those aims. And in particular, in the paper, I talk about some of the barriers that women entrepreneurs and minority entrepreneurs face in getting access to capital and getting access to the connections needed to succeed, getting access to skills that are required to start a business and to grow a business. And if you look at both women and minority entrepreneurs, and of course women minority entrepreneurs, there is a big gap in the ability of those individuals to succeed. Some of that has to do with starting out levels of net worth. As everybody knows, there is a very large black-white wealth gap in the United States. There's a very large male-female wealth gap in the United States, and that wealth gap flows through to the ability to start a business, raise funds, and succeed. Some of that has to do with isolation, both geographic isolation or cultural isolation or network isolation, access to business networks that are required to succeed, access to connections that can give you business opportunities are quite important. And there is some evidence that there is continued discrimination in our credit markets, even in today's quite competitive field. So I suggest that there are three key areas that we need to do work on: capital, skills, and networks. I should say that these three areas, capital, skills, and networks, are needed for lots of different kinds of businesses, and I think it's important that our policies recognize there are some kinds of businesses, that people sometimes call gazelles, that are going to start out small but grow big and create enormous quantities of jobs. And there are other small businesses that are going to stay small, but they can grow somewhat, and they can employ people, and they're important for our job markets and our communities as well. And we need policies that are flexible enough and different enough, adaptable enough at the local level to meet the needs of gazelles and also meet the needs of small businesses that are going to stay small. So what are the three policy areas that I suggest? The first, on access to capital, expansion of and building on two existing programs, the State Small Business Credit Initiative and the New Markets Tax Credit that you heard Vice President Biden talk about earlier today. The SSBCI works through states and local governments to provide resources that help the private sector lend more efficiently to growing small businesses. SSBCI had been operating at about $1.5 billion in total funds, and I suggest it's time to move that up to $3 billion and to reauthorize the program. I also suggest some modest changes to the New Markets Tax Credit to make it easier to use and better at meeting the needs of small businesses and minority small businesses. And I suggest authorizing that program at a level of $5 billion a year and making that program permanent. In the area of networks, I suggest that SSBCI funding be expanded to include $500 million for local initiatives to expand networks that help connect minority and women entrepreneurs to business opportunities, to peer support, and the like. And lastly, a skills initiative of also $500 million add-on to the SSBCI program to promote the skills acquisition by entrepreneurs, whether that's through online apps, or training programs, or helping small businesses hire the workers they need, or use consultants to get the mix of skills that they need to succeed at the local level. I think there's a lot of enormous potential in each of these three areas in capital, skills, and networks. This is primarily and fundamentally a matter for the private sector, but I think the government does have a role to play in catalyzing the ability of the private sector to better serve these markets. And I very much look forward to the conversation we're going to have this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well done. Adriana, do you want to come up next?
Thank you so much to the Hamilton Project and to the organizers for this great opportunity. It's really a superb team. I'm very excited to talk about strengthening reemployment in the unemployment insurance system. So I want to put this in a little bit of context. As you all know, the efforts to help the unemployed get back on their feet and get back into work have long been a policy priority. In fact, since at least the 1930s. In 1933, we introduced the Wagner-Pfizer Act, which introduced employment services across the country. In 1935, the Social Security Act introduced unemployment insurance across the country. So this goes way back to the Great Recession, to the Great Depression in that time. And more recently, this has regained importance precisely because of the Great Recession and in the aftermath of the Great Recession, simply because the number of long-term unemployed has remained very, very high, even after we know that we have actually undergone a recession and we are already on the way to a recovery, as we heard from Vice President Biden. For example, at the height of the Great Recession, we know that about 45% of the unemployed were long-term unemployed. And unfortunately, that number hasn't fallen very much. In fact, it has fallen to 30%, which is still way above what it was during the post-World War II period, during all those 2 decades, that remained roughly at 10, 20%. So that's really a big concern, mainly because the long-term unemployed have a harder time getting back jobs. So once you remain unemployed for a period of time, it becomes harder and harder to get a job. And because the long-term unemployed see their earnings fall by about 40%, they're 4 times more likely to fall into poverty, and they're much more likely to suffer from physical and mental health issues. So there are lots of social problems that come into this. This means that basically we want to get people back into jobs sooner rather than later. Well, the unemployment insurance system has long been helpful in providing income support to the unemployed, and in particular, it does help to avoid people from falling into poverty. It does help in avoiding big falls in terms of consumption. But at the same time, paradoxically, the unemployment insurance system imposes many barriers to actually getting back into jobs. And let me clarify this. Basically, there's so many requirements within the UI system and so many restrictive requirements within the UI system that it becomes very hard for the unemployed to, on the one hand, qualify to get UI benefits, and secondly, to try to take the steps and take the actions that will actually allow them to get back into jobs. So there are basically 4 different requirements that UI systems across the country impose, and these vary across states, and there are different variations, but they mainly are monetary requirements, which mean that workers have to have worked at least 2 quarters out of the 4 or 5 quarters before they file a claim. It also means they have to earn a minimum amount so that they qualify for actually getting UI benefits. It also means that there's a job separation requirement. This job separation requirement means that you have to have lost your job, been dismissed, or been laid off at no fault of your own. And there are a few exceptions in a few states that were introduced during the Recovery Act through the UI modernization efforts that allow for quits due to domestic violence, or quits due to job reallocation because of your spouse, or quits due to illness to qualify for the UI, for UI claims. But these are basically very, very rare exceptions, and they apply only in about half of the states. The third requirement is the work search requirement. The work search requirement, although it makes a lot of sense, turns out to be extremely restrictive in many occasions. So a job search requirement means that you have to go in, you have to try and register into the ES as soon as possible. In some states, UI claimants are given 3 days, like in Texas. In other states, like in my state, Maryland, you actually get about 4 weeks. But it varies a lot. But in some states, it's really a very short window. That means that you would be disqualified from getting UI claims otherwise. There is also a minimum number of jobs that you have to apply for per week. And these vary from 1 to 5 jobs. And it goes from 1 in Delaware, in Louisiana, in a few states like that. It's 2 in DC, in Maryland, in Pennsylvania. But it goes to 4 and 5 in states like Wisconsin, like Utah, like Texas, like some other states, which make it really, really demanding for the unemployed to actually continue to claim benefits. And if they don't apply for these many jobs per week, they lose their benefits. And finally, the ability and availability of requirements is also pretty restrictive. It basically means that you have to be ready to take a full-time job the minute you get an offer. It means that you have to have transportation and childcare requirements worked for, and you have to have everything ready and set to go the minute you get a job offer, that you have to accept the prevailing wage in many states. And in some states, there is even the requirement that you have to accept a pay cut after a given number of weeks claimed in order to be able to continue to qualify. So, for example, in Texas, this means that after 8 weeks, you have to accept a pay cut of about 25%. In other states like Iowa, it means a pay cut of 35% by the 18 weeks, so it becomes very restrictive. The bottom line is that these work search requirements, these availability requirements become very restrictive. It means that if you wanted to take an internship, if you wanted to do volunteer work, if you wanted to set up your own business, if you wanted to take part-time work, you would not be able to qualify for benefits anymore, and you would lose your benefits. And that means that only 27% of all unemployed actually qualify for benefits, and that many others lose their benefits along the way, and that those that keep them find it very hard to take the right steps to actually get a job. So what this proposal today does is basically to propose ways to eliminate these barriers, to eliminate many of these barriers that make it very hard for the unemployed and claimants to actually take the right steps to take jobs. So to relax some of these work search requirements, to relax some of these availability requirements and some other things that are getting in the way of actually people getting jobs. And there are basically 3 proposals that I put on the table. The first one is a self-employment assistance program, which allows the unemployed to get benefits while setting up their own business. It relaxes or waives the work search requirement, and it provides entrepreneurship training, which was just mentioned now by Mike. The Bridge to Work program is a program that offers benefits for those who are engaged in employment-based opportunities and employment-based experiences. It also waives the work search requirement, and it introduces transportation and childcare assistance, because as we know, that's another of the requirements that gets on the way. And finally, the underemployment assistance program is one that actually allows people to take part-time employment. It waives the work search requirement for those who get part-time employment, and it increases the disregard, the amount that is not going to be taken out of your unemployment benefits while you are part-time employed. So all of these requirements are relaxed in several ways by these programs, and I won't go through the details, but the cost is relatively small, because what I'm proposing here is to do 5 pilots for each of these programs and 5 randomized pilots that would allow us to do rigorous evaluations of whether these programs work or don't work before we actually scale them up at a larger level. So $16 million for the self-employment assistance program, which would pretty much pay for itself, because from past evidence that we have from the Massachusetts Enterprise Program from the late 1980s, early 1990s, we know that this program actually reduced the number of weeks claimed by about 8 weeks. And this is what would be required basically to cover these $16 million. The Bridge to Work program is the more costly one. It would cost about $173 million. And that's because it includes a transportation stipend, a childcare stipend, and a hiring bonus. But again, this is not unrealistic, simply because the hiring bonus we know reduces weeks claimed by about a week. And the other component, which is putting people in employment-based opportunities from the Work First program that was evaluated by David Otter and Susan Hausman in Detroit, shows us that it's not unrealistic to think that this is going to reduce weeks claimed for people in this group by about 8 weeks as well. And finally, the underemployment assistance program would cost about $17.2 million. This is actually a budget-neutral proposal, because this actually requires that these people who are part-time employed would only be be able to claim up to 24 weeks. And that essentially means that the $70 million could be recouped through the savings from reduced weeks of claims from those who are part-time employed. So basically, some of them are budget neutral. Many of the others are expected to be budget neutral. And if enlarged and scaled up, this would cover about 1.8 million people. It would cost only about $2,000 per person, which is really a very small amount to spend on any program that gets people back into work. And it would reduce the unemployment rate yearly by 0.2 percentage point. So every year that these programs are going on, basically 0.2 percentage point could be shaved off the unemployment rate of 5.5% that we currently have. So these are the proposals, and I look forward to the comments.
Thank you, Adriana. Well done. Both papers, terrific. Thank you. I think what we're going to do first is have our two discussants here talk about Michael's paper, react to that, ask a few questions, maybe Michael give you a chance to respond to that, then we'll come back to you, Adriana, and then we'll have a broader conversation. So Jared, do you want to go first?
Okay. Let me find my Michael notes. Yeah, okay. So I think, well, both papers strike me as important in terms of, I think it was Adriana who said taking down barriers, but of course you could view Michael's paper in the same way as well. Barriers in this case to access to credit, to equal opportunity in entrepreneurial settings. And so it's hard, I think I wrote to the folks in the group, you know, it's sort of a what's not to like, especially when you start making arguments that they'll pay for themselves. You kind of have to ask, so why aren't we doing more of this already? So I want to start off by endorsing much of what you've heard. I just have a number of questions about some details. First of all, there's one point, which is, this is not detail, this is more of a macro point, and it's one that I'll get off quickly because it's not really relevant to the kind of micro ideas that we're talking about today. But we do have to be mindful that as long as we continue to have a real shortfall of demand in our economy, whether it's consumer demand or labor demand, it's very hard for these programs to really be as effective as they could be and should be. Sometimes people like to say, well, programs like this are complementary to a more demand-side approach, ideas that help to stimulate a greater macroeconomic demand in the near-term fiscal or monetary policy. We talked about infrastructure. And I actually think that that's a little too facile in the sense that there's a kind of an ordering. That is, you could do everything that Michael and Adriana want us to do, and if there aren't the job slots there, everyone would be kind of all dressed up with nowhere to go. So it's not just a matter of, well, we need to do both. It's actually a matter, in my view, of sequencing, that it's harder for these programs to reap the kind of benefits that I think Michael and Adriana correctly identify as long as we are still facing insufficient demand. Just a couple of quick questions for Michael, and then I'll back off. One is on SSBCI, so this is the State Small Business Credit Initiative. Reading your paper, I was convinced that it should be reauthorized. I wasn't convinced it should be doubled. And I want to know what gives you the confidence that doubling the program before we learn more about its effectiveness is a good idea. And I would argue, and you know far more about this than me and probably anyone else in this room, I think you were instrumental in its origin. You know far more about this than any of us, but I would argue, at least from a person who tries to focus on these kinds of things, that we really don't know how well it works yet. We just haven't seen the kinds of evaluations that we need to see, and one might think more in terms of pilots than a doubling at this point in time. I also think that interest rates are very low. They've been very low. They're going to stay very low. Well, actually, you may have other views about that yourself. Those in financial markets might have other things to tell us. But that'll cost you, though. Yeah, you don't get that for free. The forward markets say they're going to stay very low for what it's worth. And so, again, is it obvious that we need a doubling in this climate? On the new markets tax credit, I have a different question. That I know a little bit more about because I've played in that sandbox a little. more than half, it's my understanding, and I think you said this in your paper, that more than half of the lending and the projects in the NMTC are in real estate. And I wonder if that's optimal. I kind of think it's maybe not. I don't have anything more than sort of gut to go on. I don't think that that has the biggest job multipliers. I'm not sure that that breaks the kind of entrepreneurial barriers that at least I'm envisioning in terms of allowing a kind of a more creative scope of opportunities. And I wonder if part of the the fact that so much of this tax credit ends up in real estate has to do with the structure, which you didn't get into and maybe you shouldn't get into, but it has to do, it's very patient lending. It has to be, it's a 7-year loan. Is that something that you think is a feature or a bug? It feels a little buggy to me.
Chanelle, before Michael responds, you want to pile on?
Sure. So again, I agree with all of Jared's comments, excellent papers, and appreciate the particular emphasis on minority entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, and minority women entrepreneurs. I definitely caught that. So working for the National Urban League, which represents anyone in need, but in particular African Americans, a key thought that I had throughout my reading of the paper was around just how very small the majority of these businesses are. So as you point out in the paper, 95% of African American owned small businesses are owner-operator. And receipts, annual receipts are around $50,000, just extremely small businesses. And so wondering, how do we ensure that a program like the New Market Tax Credit Program, where minimum loan amounts are significantly higher than that, are actually able to be accessible by these very, very small business owners. And in looking at the way in which the credits have been successfully invested in low-income communities, definitely the real estate investments, but other investments that certainly have a job creation result, but also I would add to the question about what is the entrepreneurship result. We kind of have used the New Market Tax Credit Program in a very roundabout way by using it as being able to actually consult on how investors are sure that they're picking projects that will have a significant community impact, and being able to take that, those fees and use them to fund our entrepreneurship centers. So it's very roundabout, but it is having a result for us. And then in terms of SSBCI, my question was more around, if you're going to double it, which we always are like, more is good, how do you ensure that the programs that you allude to in the paper that are having an impact for targeting dollars to minority-owned businesses, how do you ensure that that happens? So, as I was reading, I was thinking about Race to the Top with the Department of Education and really being able to drive some rapid change by requiring, really incentivizing with this big pot of dollars states to strive for best practices, even though, of course, anytime we ask for more money, we recognize political realities are challenging. So that's my piling on.
Great. These are incredibly helpful comments, and I really appreciate them very much. Just on the macro point, I mean, obviously, Jared, I agree with you. We need to be doing more to get the economy going still, and particularly infrastructure would be, I think, a very wise investment at this point. In terms of the SSBCI program, I don't think there's any evidence that sometimes you get to a program and you're kind of worried you're close to the demand frontier, and you're worried that if you increase it too much, you're going to get a lower quality of production. I don't think we're anywhere close to that in the SSBCI program. So you could double it, and there's still this very large untapped space in front of you. So the reason for doubling it is I think we need to hit enough scale to actually try out a bunch of things on the ground in states and localities. It's very hard for states to run small programs. It's extremely expensive for them to run small programs. So I think increasing the size will also increase the efficiency of the program and give us space to experiment with different approaches. I do think that we need to not just have an approach that spreads the money around according to a formula, which was in its first round, but to use the new funding primarily for competitive rounds that involve demonstrated success in reaching target markets, including minority and women entrepreneurs, and for programs that have built into their design very rigorous experimental design approaches to analytics, which was not possible to do in the first round. So that's the basic rationale on SSBCI. In terms of new markets tax credit, there has been, I think, quite an emphasis in the past in programs that are real estate based, and I mentioned this in the bowels of my paper, but it is very much rooted in the 7-year compliance period and the need for patient capital. And if you have small operating businesses, investors were worried about early exits and what to do with that. The IRS has quite recently changed the rules for compliance under that program so that you can reinvest the exited funds into a community development financial institution without violating the compliance rules. And I think that will open up the space for small business operating businesses much more. And I suggest also in the paper that there are further refinements the CDFI fund can do in its application process to emphasize and reward program applicants that are serving operating businesses. I should also just say that the real estate stuff is good. So I don't want to be critical of that. It's mostly commercial real estate, and it is mostly helping small businesses in economically distressed communities find spaces to operate at lower costs. So it is having an impact on operating firms, but I do think there's space for more in the operating business space. And lastly, with respect to the size of businesses, I do think we need to worry both about, as I mentioned very, very briefly in my remarks, about small firms that are going to grow into big firms that are quite successful. We need to have strategies that help them. But it's also important for communities and for job growth in low-income communities in particular to worry about and help small businesses that are just small retail businesses, lifestyle businesses. I've been working in Detroit for the last, well, quite a while to try and help small business formation in the city, and a lot of that is about how to get access to capital for neighborhood-based businesses that don't get access to the wonderful revitalization that's going on in downtown Detroit. So I think both those strategies are really important, both for economic development reasons and for entrepreneurship support and job creation reasons.
Got it, thank you. Now let's train our focus on Adriana. Jared, go ahead.
Okay. I thought Adriana approached this very smartly in the following sense. We have, as you've seen, I think you saw in her first graph, just a mountain of long-term unemployment that we'd seen nothing like in the recorded data going back to the late 1940s. And you look at that and you think that's worrisome just because long-term unemployment's got to be a bad thing. Most people of working age depend on their paychecks, and that can't be good for them. But it actually is even worse than that. There's a problem economists worry about. It's called hysteresis, which sounds like some medical disease, and to some extent it sort of is. It's the economy getting sick in the following sense. It's when a cyclical problem morphs into a structural problem. So something that would be a temporary problem if people were able to get back to work becomes a permanent one where they become deeply estranged from the job market and unable to find their way back in. Now, those of you who follow these numbers know that we've had a decline in labor force participation. Some of that's demographic, but some of it's related to the problems that Adriana is trying to attack here. In that sense, this is not just good micro, as I was talking about earlier, it's also good macro, because to the extent that you reconnect people to the job market who would otherwise kind of fade away from it, you're increasing our potential growth rates down the road. So I think that when you look at that stock of long-term unemployed, you can see a couple of things, and a lot of it, I must say, or at least in this town, seems to have to do with whether you're wearing red or blue glasses. You can look at the unemployed and see a bunch of lazy people who need to be cut off of unemployment, and so your solution to the problem that Adriana's dealing with here is to cut benefits. And many states have done so. North Carolina has had a particularly sharp cut in the amount of eligible benefits for people on the UI rolls. But she's coming at it from a different angle, which is to say, look at that stock as an opportunity, as people that we can help get back into the job market if we apply the right ideas, and she's suggesting some pilots to see which are the right ideas. Of the three ideas that she proposed, the one I like best is partial part-time work, or basically increasing the disregard so people on unemployment insurance can work part-time, get themselves back into the job market while they're still claiming some UI benefits. I worry that the self-employment piece is going to be a real tricky one to work, and I was actually a little surprised by the success that Adriana told us about of the earlier program, so I could easily be wrong here. But my sense is that one thing that she didn't mention, because it's a very nuanced piece of this, is that the people who she's targeting with these programs are people who are expected to exhaust their benefits, right?
That's right.
So that when you exhaust your benefits, 26 weeks is the usual amount, although as I mentioned, some states are cutting back to 20 and even less. But of course, in recessions, that gets extended by federal programs. When you exhaust your benefits, then you have a real problem. So in a sense, it makes sense to go after the potential exhausters, because they're the ones who will have the most trouble getting back to work, and they're also the ones who would generate the most savings for you if you can get them into the labor market, and she takes those savings, as you heard, and plows them back into the program. However, it seems to me, and I don't know exactly the model that identifies the exhausters, you know, the statistical model that says you're an exhauster, you're a potential exhauster, you're not. I would worry that many of the folks with those characteristics may not be optimal folks to set up their own businesses. Michael worries a little bit about this too in his paper, and I think it's a valid concern. On the back to work stuff, I have some concerns about displacement. I won't get into that right now. I'll just say this. I think that the partial part-time extension seems to me like a really, really good idea, and I would hope that we could do more of that. I was scratching my head a little bit to try to figure out why we're not doing more of it already, not to be a Chicago economist, but if it's so great, you know, why aren't we doing it? In fact, we don't do a lot of stuff that's great, so Chicago economists tend to be wrong about certain things. But I would like to hear your thoughts on why you think we're not doing more of that already. I have some of my own in terms of some incentive issues that administrators might worry about, and maybe I can circle back to them if need be. But that, to me, is an important question.
Great. Chanelle?
So I think that part of what I wanted to just note is I think that we rightly celebrated at the beginning of the conversation with the Vice President's comments, real improvement in the job market. But I think it's worth noting how bad it is for certain segments of our population, particularly African Americans. So literally, there's no state in this country where African-American unemployment rate is not in double digits. So when we talk about strategies that reemploy people, I think we have to really grapple with the fact that there's a segment of the population that's going to really, really struggle. And while I'm not an expert in unemployment insurance, as I was reading Adriana's paper, I thought a lot about some of the programs that our affiliates run and some things that we see are beneficial. And then some of the limitations to those. I thought it was extremely important that in the Bridge to Work proposal, there was consideration given to childcare expenses and transportation expenses. So for many of our, if I were a president of a local urban league sitting here, I would say, the way our model works is we provide wraparound services. Somebody comes in, they express a need, we sit down and evaluate them for everything they need. Because often, if someone is coming in looking for a job, they may have housing issues, they probably have transportation issues, they probably have childcare issues. And so even to allow people the luxury of participating in a program, providing financial assistance is critical. So really connecting reemployment efforts and unemployment benefits, I think, is a no-brainer. And then adding those additional supports, really, really crucial to helping those programs to be successful. So kind of there might be like a hodgepodge of the way these different proposals pull great ideas together. I think that another thing that we've noticed is that because of the challenges that Jared talked about on the demand side, even when we're able to have really great success with training people, and giving them a stipend, such as the Mature Workers Program, where you put individuals who have lost their job and they've been unemployed for a particular amount of time, and they're of a certain age, giving them access to skills retraining and community service-based stipend-supported work, the placement rate is only about 13%. And that's not just for us. So it's very challenging to get people back into the workforce. So while they're benefiting from this program during that time, they're still in a challenging place when the period comes to an end. And so definitely the limitations on the unemployment insurance program timeline still raise challenges for me. And then thinking about the entrepreneurship piece as well. Obviously, I think that there's some real interesting potential to helping people to start hang out their shingle. But I think that, again, 26 weeks is going to be a really short period of time to try to get people to be able to launch something. And it seems that it would need something on the back end that's kind of like a feeder. So once you've exhausted your 20 weeks or your 26 weeks, that you're now set up and eligible to apply for the programs that, that Michael references. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. These are really great comments. So I wanted to start going back to the demand issue because I think that is pretty crucial. In fact, the whole idea behind the CA, the Self-Employment Assistance Program, is, well, there are jobs out there, let's create those jobs. And in fact, when this was tried out in Washington State, in Massachusetts, back in the 80s and early 90s, it was very effective precisely in a very weak labor market. So it is a very viable alternative given even the current recovery that we're facing. The Bridge to Work program actually does introduce hiring incentives and hiring bonuses, which are meant to incentivize employers actually to create jobs. And if they're in the fence about creating a job or not, right, to jump in the pool and say, I'm going to hire this person. So while I agree that we need to continue working on both fronts, there were components in each of these proposals that I included that actually do target the issue of demand as well. I love the way you put in the history is this question. I actually think my proposal challenges the conventional wisdom of what economists think about why people who claim UI remain unemployed for so long. So the conventional wisdom that economists have is, well, benefits are too high, the reservation wages are too high, and precisely because reservation wages are too high, they're being unrealistic about what types of jobs they can get out there. They're not accepting jobs, and that's why they remain unemployed. And then the other alternative conventional wisdom is, well, wages are too high, people are not searching hard enough, there's this moral hazard problem, and so they're not getting jobs, right? And so what's the solution to that? The solution to that is let's lower benefits, and let's make things even more restrictive, right? Let's do what Texas and what Iowa do, which is to force people to accept that wage cut. Or let's actually put, like, really carry on the number of job applications they need to do per week, because they're just, you know, they must be shirking. They're just not doing their job and searching hard enough. So this actually turns that conventional wisdom around, and that's what I like about these proposals. It's saying, actually, that's not the problem. We're just not allowing enough flexibility within the system to let people do the types of things that will help them get back into work. I wanted to talk about the partial time work, why not more of this is happening. Some of it is happening. The problem is that these regards are so low that in effective terms they're not working. I think what I propose here, this issue of allowing people to apply for these up until the 24th week, would make it very palatable to many states because it would make it budget neutral. And I think it's a very simple thing of reducing by just 2 weeks, right? Which is exactly what you expect the effect of the program to be, to increase by 2 weeks the speed which people get back to work. So I think that would be a very good solution, and maybe that's one reason why this has not been taken up with more efforts. With regards to the bridge to work, I think displacement could be an issue. I thought I had addressed that as much as I could compared to, say, the Georgia Works or back to work programs in Texas and Utah that were introduced during the Great Recession. I, in fact, put a lot of caution there in determining that this could not replace people who have been on layoff. This could not replace people on strike, on lockout, right? That these jobs had to be created out there. So there was enough curve there that we wouldn't expect this to have the same sort of effect, say, that the mini jobs had in Germany, where you had a whole lot of people flowing in temporary jobs, that were not permanent, that were not directly created by employers, and where you have minimum protections in terms of minimum wages, in terms of workers' compensation that are built into the program. So while one may worry about take-up of the program precisely because there is actually quite a few restrictions to qualify, I do not worry as much about displacement. I think one needs to find the right balance to avoid displacement, but not to discourage people from taking up a program like this.
Can I respond a little? First of all, so everybody knows, just to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about, this displacement concern is the idea that in her Bridge to Work program, she suggests that we incentivize employers to create a job for someone who's subsidized temporarily while they're on UI. And the idea that we worry about is that the employer will say, great, I'll take subsidized worker X and lay off unsubsidized worker Y, and so we've not created a net new job. And so that is concerning, and you're absolutely right. You have various measures in there to try to avoid that. I mean, my personal experience in this is that the tougher you make it for employers to have to follow rules around this sort of thing, the less likely they are to use the program. But secondly, I'm not...
By the way, I counted up, the Bridge to Work program has 9 separate design requirements.
Yeah, so that kind of underscores
I suppose
my
that's
point.
what HR people are made for.
But actually, so let me
very
say
hard to do.
actually that I just finished an evaluation of the HAR Act that was introduced in 2010, which introduced many similar of these requirements. I find today, 5 years later, that in fact the impact of the HAR Act was quite substantial.
Well, that's
so
good.
even though we were very worried at the time that there wasn't enough take-up and this wasn't going to have any effect, I can tell you 5 years later that we're finding
I think that's very good to know, and I didn't know that you'd done that, and I think we don't know enough about that, so that's very helpful information. The only other point I was going to make, about the partial, so again, to make sure we're all on the same page here, what Adriana is suggesting is that we allow part-time workers to disregard more of their earnings instead of subtracting those earnings out of their benefits so that they end up better off from working part-time while they're still on UI. NELP's written a little bit about this and done some nice work, and I think one of the things that they've suggested is that one of the problems that UI administrators have is that they're worried that if they disregard too much of the part-time earnings, somebody can make pretty much what they would make working full-time by working part-time. And that is something that the administrators worry about, and so that's a balancing act that they're trying to do. So I would argue that while we need to certainly increase those exemptions, when I was trying to figure out why they're not doing more of it, I did run into that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Let me also answer the last one on self-employment assistance and targeting exostees. So, in fact, it is true that not everybody's going to be an entrepreneur, right? Not everybody's going to be a good person who's going to go and set up their own business. But we do know that there is 1 out of 10 Americans who is self-employed and sets up their own business, right? So it's not a trivial number of people that actually choose this path. In fact, the targeting exostees is not as bad as it seems because it does also have this requirement that there would be a business proposal that has to be written and that allows people to self-select already into the program. So what are the things that are used to determine whether people are more or less likely to exhaust? This is the worker profiling and reemployment system. It's demographic characteristics, it's previous work history, all sorts of things like that. So it is certainly a concern, but it's not something I think.
Well, that's why you do a pilot.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so let me address a question here to Michael. We have a question from the audience.
I haven't answered Chanelle, so I don't want to ignore that.
All right, we'll come back to that. But
Okay.
I'm going to dig in a little bit to the issue you were just also talking about, which is the audience question is, both proposals call for assistance to help people start their own businesses. Many businesses fail. For people already with low assets, what happens to those whose businesses fail, especially if they have debt, not just the average, but tail risk? So, but let me throw something into this. My life as an entrepreneur, it's really hard. I've funded hundreds of entrepreneurial businesses. A lot of them failed. It's really hard. And so the notion that you go from unemployment insurance to being an entrepreneur seems to me to be pretty far-fetched. And why aren't we instead talking about, but entrepreneurial businesses are really important. And so why aren't we instead talking about the skills necessary to help to be successful as an employee or a partner in an entrepreneurial business, whether that's bookkeeping or sales and marketing or customer service or whatever it might be, so that you can work your way into the entrepreneurial world rather than leap right to from unemployment insurance to a business plan, debt funding, and and Facebook.
So you want to start?
So
I was going to go for Michael. Hasn't had much chance to jump in here yet, so let's go. Let Michael go first, and then Adriana.
I mean, just want to make clear.
And Chanelle, I know you have a point of view about this too, from the communities your
Yeah.
organization works in. Would you go after that too, please? Okay.
So my proposal is not focused on unemployed workers, just to be absolutely clear. So my proposal is about people like you, but who are not quite as connected to networks, maybe not as may not have quite the educational background or the net worth to start. I totally agree, Glenn, that this is a just brutally hard thing to do. I mean, being an entrepreneur is incredibly difficult. Most of the time entrepreneurs fail. Most successful entrepreneurs have failed many times and will fail again many times. And that's sort of the baseline. But I do think we can do exactly what you said. We can help connect people with the skills they need to be successful. Sometimes that means some training program, but sometimes it means helping them hire the right consultant or hire the right worker to work with them. We can help connect them to networks that are going to help them to succeed, networks of their peers and networks of business opportunities. And we can improve their access to capital. And with each of those three elements, you're increasing the odds that doing this very, very hard thing is going to have a slightly better outcome than it otherwise would. But it is by no means a guarantee of success. I mean, as you said, most small businesses fail, most entrepreneurs fail, most successful entrepreneurs fail many times. And this is not going to change the fundamental nature of that part of our economy, which is great and cool and works really well. It's going to help more people get into it who could be successful if they had a little bit more of these kind of elements to succeed.
So let me ask the same question, Adriana, to you in a slightly different way before we get to Chanelle, which is all three of your proposals waive the work search requirement. Waive the work search requirement, which is one of the requirements for UI that you say makes it very hard for people to get back in the labor force. Why isn't a better proposal to waive the work search requirement in favor of a skills and training requirement than these kinds of programs?
Either, right? And there are states that actually allow that. They allow for people who are undergoing training to waive the work search requirement. So those exist. And they could be expanded, granted, but I'm not against that. With regards to entrepreneurship training, though, I do very much outline this idea that there need to be workshops, that the skills need to be built to be a good entrepreneur, finding out about accounting, about finance, about HR, right, about taxes, about regulations and permits that need to be completed, all sorts of things that an entrepreneur needs to know about. But let me tell you something about these earlier studies that were done during the early 1990s. Even though it seems a little far-fetched to move for people from UI into self-employment and entrepreneurship, what these studies show is that people who engage in these SEA programs back then increased their probability of employment by something like 9%. And moreover, and this goes back to Chanelle's question too, not only are they more likely to be self-employed, there is also a group that is more likely to be employed. So this is all against being unemployed, right? So there's one of two channels. You go, you succeed, you stay with your business. The other channel, and granted the failure rate is very high for many small businesses, they fail. This actually helps them, and the skills they accumulate during this time period actually helps them to get another job. Plus, they don't have that emptiness in their curriculum and right, their work experience that stigmatizes them and that doesn't allow them to get the next job.
Now, last comment of the day for you.
Oh, great. I will be quick. I mean, I think that training is critical. We have been kind of adding an entrepreneurship center or two every year because we really see them being successful. And so I think that we have to define success. When we're talking about the types of unemployment numbers that we're facing, I think it's a mistake to say that because a small business fails, it wasn't successful. If the goal is to provide an individual with employment and income for a period of time, and then at the end of that period of time, you transition into being an employee again, That's been a real success for you. And then finally, just the, I think remembering what the aspiration is. We know that most hiring is done by small businesses, and we know that most minority hiring is done by minority-owned small businesses. So to the extent that we can invest in individuals starting these businesses, it's worth it.
Great. Thank you very much. Congratulations on such fine work. Thank you all for being here so late in the day.